everybody. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of First Amendment Museum Unscripted. Today, I'm joined by three colleagues here, and we're going to talk about obscenity. So go ahead, Mr. Whitney Strub, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Whit Strub. I'm an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, Newark, and I've written scholarly work on obscenity, including the book Obscenity Rules about the Roth v. U.S. case in 1957 that set the basic template for obscenity doctrine at the Supreme Court.
Hi, my name is Ari Cohn. I am free speech counsel at Tech Freedom, where we focus on technology policy. Before that, I was the director of the Individual Rights Defense Program at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which has since rebranded to expand beyond education. So I've been in the First Amendment world for a decade now, and what a decade it's been.
And last but not least.
My name is Jeffrey Douglas. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Santa Monica, California. I've represented the adult entertainment industry since 1982. I'm the chair of the board of directors of the Adult Industries Trade Association, the Free Speech Coalition. I've defended half a dozen or so obscenity cases that have gone to trial. Years ago did a study of state level and federal, but trial level obscenity prosecutions throughout the United States. So I looked at the materials that were prosecuted from 87 to 95, 94, something like that, about 2,500 prosecutions across the United States.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you all for joining us. It's going to be a good discussion. I'm going to start by asking a very basic question. Maybe it's so basic it might be a tricky question. What is obscenity? Anybody can just go ahead and take it. And
start with Whit on that one, I think. You wrote the book.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously it's one of those words that has multiple usages, right? There's the vernacular usage of it, and then there's the formal legal definition. And I think, the difference between those two leads to a lot of confusion. But I mean, at a formal legal level, it's predominantly, what's the classic? I mean, my God, I wrote the book on this and I should remember it verbatim. But the classic definition is, material that, taken as a whole, offends contemporary community standards by relying on a prurient interest. And then that was, modified piecemeal over the years. But fundamentally, I think that's the core of the legal definition. And it's also material that therefore does not have the protection of the First Amendment. That's the also critical factor, I would say.
And, go ahead, Jeffrey.
I was just going to say, as in real life, it is the most irrational, bizarre, intellectually indefensible rule the United States Supreme Court has ever issued. No one understands what it means. At the core of it is contemporary community standards, but no one knows what that means. There is no equivalent in real life. As a colleague of mine says, there's no community standard for ice cream. And insofar as one could fantasize that there's a community standard for the depiction of sex, how in the world will we know what it is? Because the one thing you don't talk to colleagues or fellow bus riders about is what you fantasize about sex, what you watch on your home video about sex. Sex is a secret. So how in the world would anyone have any idea what the contemporary community standard is? It's asinine.
So is obscenity just porn? And is that an okay term to use, or is that that's a genuine question. I don't know if that's how me and my friends might say talk about it.
I find it inoffensive, and I represent the industry, so yeah.
Okay. I don't offend anybody. So is obscenity just porn, or is there more to obscenity than just something like porn?
Well, I think you just hit on the problem that Jeffrey identified, is that nobody knows what the hell it means.
I mean, it has to be the Venn diagram of pornography is immense, and it's entirely subjective, right? the shows that currently are big hits on TV, Game of Thrones, American Gods, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, would have been deemed pornography. Certainly when the Miller case came down. So, and to this day, there are many, many people that would characterize it as being pornographic. So the scope of what pornography is legally undefined and is almost entirely subjective.
And
The,
you mentioned the Miller case.
yeah, the case that followed Roth, which is the current operative definition of legal obscenity, Miller v. California, 3-part test, and there's just no point in discussing it. Like I said, it has some of the elements of the Roth test that we described, but it's totally highly technical in the weeds, and like I said, in my opinion, meaningless. But whatever that the legal definition of obscenity is, it is a tiny fraction of whatever your definition of pornography is. When you consider at the absolute peak of obscenity prosecutions in the United States, when the most extreme people were in charge of the Justice Department, heading the unit, they prosecuted 30 cases twice. So a total of maybe 75 cases in 8 years, during which time so that's pre-internet, but during which time there were video stores and mail order constantly. So with millions of transactions occurring every day, the feds did, in say a 10-year period, 70 cases. And on the state level, you're talking about, and I'm wildly exaggerating, 5,000 cases. So it's clear that mere nudity or sort of routine masturbation or intercourse is not obscene. That's just either art or pornography, depending on the quality of the photography, I suppose. So, as I said, whatever your boundaries are for the definition of pornography, obscenity is a tiny, tiny fragment of that.
So I'll be honest, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because we're having some obscenity drama here in the state of Maine, which I don't know if you guys have heard about, but essentially right now it's really easy to get whatever you want on a vanity license plate here in Maine. If I want to put something obscene on it, okay. And so the government is trying to crack down on these vanity plates as being obscene. And I think one of the comments was, how are kids going to play the license plate game if there's obscene license plates out there? Which I don't think anybody's playing the license plate game anymore in the iPhone age. But what do you guys would you say?
I want to know where the pure prurient interest comes in on a license plate. Who's looking at a license plate and getting turned on? We have other problems if that's obscenity.
So what are your guys' thoughts on that, on the Maine license plate controversy?
Yeah, I was reading up on it. I love it. I love that you've got 2 different vanity plates in Maine that both say "crazy bitch," one with a K, one with a C, and among many, many other examples. I think that speaks to that slippage that I mentioned. Clearly this is not a matter of criminal obscenity. No license plate could cross that threshold. At the same time, it speaks to the kind of other pockets, I think, of governmental, regulation of speech within particular bureaucratic spaces that isn't a matter of criminal obscenity, but they're using obscene broadly, in that way, which I think, is understandable and palatable to most people, even as they're sort of legally misusing it. We had a similar case in New Jersey last year. A woman, a huge Trump MAGA fan, who had a bunch. Are we allowed to swear on this podcast or not?
Oh yeah, sure.
So I mean, she had a bunch of like "fuck Joe Biden" posters, like huge, posters on her front lawn in Roselle Park, which is pretty near where I live in Newark, New Jersey. And the city declared those obscene and told her she had to take them down or face fines. The ACLU got involved and she won. The posters stayed up, but again, it was certainly not legally correct for them to call "fuck Joe Biden" obscene. It simply isn't. The court weighed in on the issue of the F word in 1971. It was not obscene to say "fuck the draft" on a coat in Cohen v. California. So I think that's kind of what's going on in Maine. Probably it's just sort of a misusage of obscenity as a kind of vernacular term rather than a legal term there. At least that's my reading.
Well, I want to hit on something that Whit just mentioned, and that the slippage factor, because that really goes to a fundamental problem which Jeffrey really leaned into at the outset of this being just an absurd doctrine that makes no sense and is probably one of the dumbest things we've ever done from a legal perspective. First of all, I don't think I'm going to find any disagreement here when I say that any test for whether or not speech is protected that relies on, well, does the community think that I should be allowed to say this here, is garbage from the outset. That is incoherent from a First Amendment standpoint. And it stems from this just kind of old puritanical fear of all things sexual, or I guess excretory. Although if you look through history, there really hasn't been that much fear of it over the years. But it's important to remember that a lot of the prosecutions over the years and the controversy of the years have been directly targeted at marginalized communities' materials. And we are seeing a resurgence of that. We have two states at least, Virginia and Wyoming, where the government is either taking action or somebody has requested the government take action against people for offering books, bookstores or librarians that just are basically about being gay and or getting pregnant. Things that can't be obscenity in any meaningful sense, and certainly not in any legal sense. But the process is the punishment so often. And we're seeing this kind of determination to make things into obscenity. And I will, I'll hit both sides here, because I think the people on the left have done it too, that try to turn things like Fox News is kind of obscene because they're lying, or California trying to say that violent video games should be treated the same as obscenity in Brown versus EMA. There's this constant desire to shoehorn different quote unquote undesirable speech into the obscenity rubric, and frankly that's the danger of it, and that's why we need to do away with the doctrine for good.
So Jeffrey, go ahead, and then I'll ask a question.
The other thing I was going to say is that whether it's a conservative court or a middle of the road court, I personally don't believe there's ever been a liberal Supreme Court, but however you want to characterize it, there is unanimity wherever you are in the political spectrum that the only way for government to regulate anything involving communication is with extraordinary precision. Because if the rules are soft and indeterminate, government abuse of that discretion, that ambiguity, that vagueness is intolerable. So the terms that I saw in the material that you sent me, Maxwell, were offensive. And offensive is inherently subjective and essentially meaningless. So clearly the state could not regulate bumper stickers. There's virtually no length that you could put on a bumper sticker that could justify state intervention. So the notion that there's an audience of children out there who will be harmed or offended or whatever by the presence of words on the back of a car that's not going to be good enough. So the issue is going to be if the state of Maine is issuing the license plates, do they have a right to control what it is that's coming out of their printers, or out of the prisons that are making the license plates? And, very conservative courts recently have said that the trademark and patent offices can't reject language that is clearly offensive. A brand of, I've forgotten what it was, t-shirts or something, a product that wanted to trademark the word FUCT, which is clearly yet another reference to fuck. And the offensiveness, the undeniable potential offensiveness of that was not, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, was not sufficient to allow the office, the U.S. government, to bar trademark protection. And then a couple years earlier, a case where a music group wanted to get intellectual property protection for the slants, a term typically offensive to Asians. That was the justification. It was an Asian band frontman that wanted to call his band the Slants. So I don't know. Those cases aren't entirely controlling here, but strongly suggestive that there's a problem with having as vague a determinative as offensive as being a basis to deny a license plate. And in the material I saw, I thought that the government agency was saying, don't drive your New Hampshire license plates into Maine with something offensive on it either, which is even worse. But I don't think that constitutionally they have a leg to stand on, because I don't believe that they can come up with a sufficiently precise term to be able to have a person know in advance whether the selection of words, letters that you want to put on your license plate is going to be appropriate or not, and that is absolutely required.
So this is a question for all of you guys. Don't parents have a right for their children not to see something like FUCK unwillingly if they're driving down the road? What are the merits of the parents of Maine want to have their children not exposed to content unwittingly that is obscene or offensive? Is that a valid argument? Ari, you look like you got it.
I mean, any parent who thinks that they're going to be able to take their kids out into the world and have them never see anything they're going to have to explain why it's quote unquote bad is deluding themselves. But beyond that, time and time again, in all the cases, I'm thinking a lot of the major speech cases, especially in the online sphere, the Supreme Court's been pretty clear that, we can't set the boundaries for what adults can say in public based on what's appropriate for the youngest of children or the most sensitive of communities. And so, sometimes if you want to be a parent, then be a parent. Explain to your kids why you shouldn't use that word. But that's no justification for saying that I can't walk down the street and say X thing that you wouldn't want your child saying.
Sorry, wait, were you going to say something?
No, I was fundamentally just going to agree. I mean, it's a legitimate concern as a parent, but it's not a constitutional right. I don't think there's any basis for asserting that it is.
Jeffrey?
I'm the parent of a 14-year-old, so it wasn't that long ago that in many public settings, you just wince. Took my kid to a baseball game, a Dodger game, and, by the time the beers hit, everyone around us was just streaming crudities of one sort or another. And that's that that's the culture that we exist in, and people may not like it. But is there any difference in terms of parenting between a written word on a bumper sticker or a license plate or being in a grocery store? It's the parent's responsibility to explain, and as Ari said, I think, to explain what crude language is, why it's inappropriate for children to use, and why in fact it's inappropriate for mature adults to be so inarticulate.
I feel very attacked.
Same. I think we've already dropped the F. I think we've already dropped the F word a couple times just over the course of the past 20 minutes. So where I work at the First Amendment Museum, and we sort of view the First Amendment as in these very grandiose terms of great speeches and great marches and great Supreme Court moments where rights were defended. Where does obscenity and pornography fall into this? We're all about, I think our mission is something along the lines of we want to promote the understanding and use of the First Amendment so that all can reap the benefits in this democracy of ours. And we think of it as very political terms. But what's the value in defending pornography or something? Anybody that logged on, that spent, an hour on Pornhub, which I certainly haven't, can tell you that there's nothing on there that is advancing democracy. There's nothing on there that is contributing meaningfully to the political and social discourse of our country. So what's the point of defending this? Or Jeffrey, it sounds like you've gone to court over this. I mean, what's the value? What's the social good? How is this defending democracy, if at all?
Well, first of all, the First Amendment is a lot broader than protecting democracy, but I think, if I heard you correctly, I do disagree with your premise that the content of, say, Pornhub, crude, explicit depictions of sex, do not have political importance. Sexuality is at the core of individuality. It's at the core of personal integrity. And there are no or very limited opportunities to explore human sexuality in our culture outside of the realm of what we marginalize as pornography. So that's a necessary, a socially valuable way for people to explore it, for people who are have components of their sexual identity or sexual fantasy life that is dynamic within them. They want to explore it. Pornography is the means to do it. If assuming that one is not entirely committed to a 1950s version of heterosexual conformity, an enormous amount of the movements that have allowed a broader definition of normalcy, the shift of homosexuality from being a pathological in the 1960s, when the American Psychological and Psychiatric Associations stopped defining homosexuality as an illness. There's a direct line between that normalization and the availability, and therefore the normalization through pornography. And absolutely the case with transgender individuals. it has impact in racial communities because racial tension is both depicted and a source of fantasy inversions and all of that through pornography. I don't agree with the premise, but even if it were true, even if it were demonstrable that material that's primarily sexual in content has less value than material that has little or no sexual content, an indefensible position. But let's assume it for the sake of argument. The First Amendment's vitality arises from marginal speech. All of the heroic cases that came before the Supreme Court in the First Amendment arena came from speech that was profoundly offensive to somebody that the government attacked. That's why there's a Supreme Court case, right? So it's at the margins that the First Amendment is protected, because if you don't protect at the outside, then there's no protection at the core. That's been the case in the entire history of First Amendment jurisdiction, litigation.
Right. Whit and Ari, do you want to respond to my argument, my claim?
Well, I think, I mean, and this is just building on what Jeffrey just said, but I think the one thing I would add to it is just that, the national myth of the First Amendment is profoundly ahistorical. We like to tell ourselves as a society that, these founding fathers proclaimed the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging free speech, and somehow that just immediately took root as a dominant national political culture, but that's not true. Censorship was very much the norm, whether it was the Alien and Sedition Acts in the 1790s, Southern states censoring abolitionist literature. The modern First Amendment is really a product of the early 20th century, a fight from socialists and anarchists and unionists and pacifists, particularly during World War I, and the legal cases that came out of that are what we've sort of retroactively projected backward as the First Amendment. But that is its political life, is a product of particularly the 19 teens. And so when you think about it that way, like Jeffrey said, it's always been marginalized people, and not necessarily, respectable and reputable people. It's disreputable political and sexual positionalities that have fought for free speech. And so, gay physique magazine publishers in the 1960s and pornographers in the 1970s, we owe a lot of our political freedom to, people who we might not particularly admire in other capacities. Is it my Zoom that's giving feedback? I keep hearing feedback. I don't know if the others are hearing that.
Is it mine? Maybe I should mute myself when I'm not talking.
I can also mute when I'm not talking. But anyway, that was basically my thought. Just, that important historical legacy of disreputable and particularly politically radical figures as building the First Amendment as we know it.
Yeah, I think that was very well said by the both of you. I would add also just maybe that, the what we perceive as the social value of speech really should have nothing to do with it. And that comes a lot from the fact that, a lot of the stuff we now consider, as both Whit and Jeffrey both noted, a lot of stuff we now consider kind of standard, mundane, run-of-the-mill stuff, was once considered of absolutely no or like negative social value. The whole value proposition of the First Amendment is taking away the decision of the government and majorities of deciding what speech is quote unquote valuable enough to protect. If that's the, if we're making the decisions based on what we all think is important enough to protect, the First Amendment kind of just becomes a nullity, because then you just, whatever the majority thinks ought to be said can be said, and whatever not. And that's just kind of at odds with everything that we currently, as we just noted, how we currently perceive the First Amendment. And he's absolutely right that there was a whole long time at the beginning of this country's history where the First Amendment was basically relegated to the butler's pantry or whatever, and never really pulled out and used. So, to me, it doesn't matter one bit whether or not society finds speech valuable, because I'm sure that plenty of my speech has no redeeming value. Let's be honest.
So, how has the modern development of the internet shaped obscenity? How has, we're in 2022 now. How has obscenity changed since 2000, 1990, 1980, 1970? What is the internet doing to this concept of obscenity?
I'll start from the sort of legal point of view. Two elements of the Miller definition of obscenity have been, the internet has made prosecutions enormously difficult. One component is that the material must be taken as a whole, so that you can't take James Joyce's Ulysses and pull out all the dirty parts and say, this is a bunch of crude sex, which, if anyone was capable of actually getting through James Joyce's Ulysses, there's a hell of a lot of that. But when you take it as a whole, as an entirety, it's obviously a lot more than crude sex. So taken as a whole is built into the definition of protected speech. So when you look at a website, if you take it as a whole, that means that the jury has to view potentially a lifetime worth of material. You mentioned Pornhub. There are probably certainly thousands, but more likely tens of thousands of websites containing adult material where, if you reviewed every frame of the content of the website, which, if it were any other medium, a book, a magazine, a movie, you would be required to do so under the test, everyone would die of old age. It would take literally more than a lifetime to review the material on Pornhub. So the government has to overcome that fundamental definition in order to prosecute a website. The second one is community standard. If you're prosecuting an adult bookstore or a movie that has been shipped into Tampa or a geographical location, you can make an argument that there is a defined community within which the material is to be judged, a community standard against which the material is to be judged. With the internet, that is a much more difficult proposition to assert, and there's one opinion out of the Ninth Circuit that says if you're prosecuting material that is transmitted over the internet, the standard is no longer the geographical spot in which it is viewed, but rather it is essentially the internet itself. Internet is the community, the world. So because of the extraordinary difficulty with those, even though there are trial courts that have found ways to get around it, the United States government has never prosecuted a website per se for obscenity. They have prosecuted websites that have, through the post, transmitted tangible material. So Evil Angel, Max Hardcore, the handful of federal prosecutions against individuals running websites, they have only prosecuted them based on tangible material sent through the mails. So that's a sort of an objective measure that the internet has rendered the Miller definition of obscenity obsolete. The second part of that is that, as I mentioned earlier, when in the pre-internet days, when you're talking about millions of transactions a day over video store counters, it's essentially there are an infinite number of transactions a day of sexually explicit material over the internet. Pornhub is in the top 10 of all websites in terms of audience traffic. So if you take, say, the top 10 adult websites, it dwarfs everything. It's certainly equivalent to YouTube. So what that means is that whatever that community standard meant, it has changed, because pornography of all forms is now available to everyone all the time. And so that impacts what people find offensive, what people find tolerable, what people are curious about, what people are happy to watch and masturbate to, even though they may be deeply offended that somebody else is doing it, and willing to restrict other people from doing it. It becomes transformative when it's available to you to look at and consume, and that's what's happened now.
I would submit that in a sane world, the next time the Supreme Court had an opportunity to confront an obscenity prosecution or some kind of obscenity law, it would realize that not only is the obscenity framework just incoherent nonsense, but they have already, in effect, without really doing it, called it into question. And I'll give as quick a rundown of that as possible. In U.S. v. Stevens, a case over depictions of animal cruelty, the statute said it is illegal to create, possess, or manufacture or sell, I think, depictions of animal cruelty if the depiction or if the activity that was engaged in to make the video is illegal in the state where it was ultimately viewed, possessed, sold, manufactured, yada, yada. And one of the big problems the court had with it was that meant that something that not covered under animal cruelty laws in the state where it was done, if that material found its way into a state where such activity could not have been legally done, that would be prosecutable. And that is literally what happens with obscenity law, with the community standards framework. If something that one community would not find obscene manages to kind of waft over into, say, some rural Texas area where, they might not like such a thing, that can be prosecutable. And, it's insane to anyone who's reading this stuff that you would treat like obscenity differently, that concern would just somehow disappear because the topic is sex. That makes absolutely no sense to anyone who just isn't irrationally frightened of anything that has to do with sex. But inherently, the Supreme Court has already called the Miller framework into question. And like I said, in a sane world, they would be honest about that and basically toss obscenity doctrine out the window. What I predict instead happens is that slowly but surely it kind of gets shifted into dead letter in the same way that some of the other speech restrictive laws have, those cases upholding them have never really been formally overruled, like the group libel case, and just kind of lurks there in the background, even though it's been denigrated into, complete nonsense. So, we don't live in a sane world, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'll jump on and add. I mean, I think obviously it's unthinkable that a Supreme Court majority is going to overturn the Comstock Act of 1873, which is the foundation of federal obscenity law. I think the closest we've ever come probably was in the mid 70s when there would have been William O. Douglas, Hugo Black, and William Brennan, who ironically was the very architect of Supreme Court obscenity doctrine, but renounced his own doctrine in the 70s when he finally hit the wall and got frustrated with it. And the three of them probably would have voted to overturn the Comstock Act, but that's it. I mean, there's absolutely nobody thinks even the liberal justices now would overturn it. But I agree about its fading relevance. I mean, I think you can see that under, at least at the federal level, I mean, under Democratic administrations, Clinton and Obama had no interest in pursuing obscenity cases beyond, child pornography, which is its own separate legal category anyway. And Republican administrations will always kind of beat their chest about this. George W. Bush kind of revived obscenity for a while to try to rouse up the Christian right. After he got reelected, he just kind of let it fade away to a large extent. And Trump in 2016 promised to revive obscenity prosecutions, but didn't see it through. And I think that my reading of that is, the Christian right was perfectly satisfied because they knew he was going to give them Roe v. Wade, and that was more than enough to satisfy the kind of conservative legal movement. Obscenity is kind of a second tier priority for them. But in terms of obscenity fading away as a sort of, the sort of heyday of obscenity being probably the 50s through the 80s, I do think too, you can see the way the internet has changed that in terms of making obscenity, like Jeffrey said, I mean, increasingly irrelevant, but also providing new tools for anti-porn activists. They don't need obscenity law. They've got financial modes of regulation, which I'm sure Ari can speak about in much more granular detail than me, but, sort of, canceling out payments and attacking sites that way using PayPal, credit card companies, things like that. It seems to me like that's the new frontier of the kind of anti-porn movement after they tried public health laws that really kind of haven't gotten a lot of traction yet. States like Utah will pass laws declaring pornography a public health crisis, and then they won't do anything about it. It's a moment for the conservative politicians to, grandstand for a moment, but it's not actually an implemented policy framework in any meaningful way, I think. So that's kind of my take on it, at least where we're at right now, and kind of where we're headed.
I think even worse is
is that the last time the United States Supreme Court took up an obscenity case, that is, where a piece of work was challenged as being obscene that made it up to the Supreme Court, was in Miller v. California. They announced what the rule was, and they have put their fingers in their ears, closed their eyes, and said, ever since then. So, yeah, it's unlikely the Supreme Court is going to ever or in the foreseeable future modify it, because they won't take the cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like they did with fighting words. The last time a fighting words conviction was upheld was the case that created the fighting words doctrine. It's one of those things where I think they probably sit back and said, all right, well, we let the bees loose and now we'll just watch them swarm everyone. But I think one of the other threats is Texas SB 8 style law that starts creating private causes of action against, and this is a threat to pretty much every constitutional right, and that's why it's a travesty that the court didn't really put its foot down at all on that. But we're seeing a case, the case where states are trying to say, oh, well, we're not going to enforce it, so we're going to basically forestall facial challenges to this law, and then people can just sue each other for saying things that they don't like, and then the law's never going to get struck down, and each individual defendant's going to have to fight it all the way up. And as it always is, the process is the punishment.
So we're running low on time, so we're going to have to call it, which is a bummer because I can think of about a million other questions I'd like to ask. But I just want to give you guys the opportunity to promote anything you're doing, any projects you've worked on, any books you have, any organizations you represent, any way people can reach out that may be watching this that want to learn more. I just want to give you guys that opportunity for anybody watching this. So I'll just go do Whit, Ari, and Jeffrey again in the same order we introduced ourselves.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I tweet at Whit Strub. I mostly just throw random rants onto the internet. It's hardly the most professional venue for me, but yeah, I mean, I think probably the thing, like I said at the start, I mean, the thing that I've written that's most relevant here is the book Obscenity Rules, about the Roth case. And maybe just one closing comment, if that's all right for me. I mean, one thing that I had to deal with in writing that was, I mean, you know, I think like everybody here, I'm primarily a First Amendment absolutist who does, you know, certainly does not support government suppression of speech. But one of the fundamental contradictions of this whole framework of obscenity that we're talking about is that when William Brennan upheld the Comstock Act in 1957 in the Roth case, he said that the history of the United States is not one of the absolutist use of the First Amendment. And as much as we might wish that weren't true, historically he's right. And you know, that is a foundational contradiction here that I think is essentially impossible to resolve, because this is not a nation that was founded on a culture of free speech in an absolutist sense, even as the language of the First Amendment is completely unambiguous there. And so I think we're left, you know, we're stuck in the legacy of that contradiction. We're caught within that. And I don't think anybody's found an actual practical way to resolve that yet. So that's kind of the ongoing challenge for everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, I tweet at Ari Cohn, ARICOHN. I do it frequently and often intemperately, so govern yourselves accordingly with your expectations. But you know, my work right now is focused primarily on attempts to have the government intervene in online speech. And fortunately, that hasn't hit a ton on obscenity vis-a-vis a lot of the social media platforms, at least since Sesta Fosta a few years back. But I can see it, you know, kind of coming into scope slowly but surely as we see some of these state laws. And, you know, one thing I've noticed, I guess my closing statement will be, it's always the people, you know, and actually not, I'm not going to say the people, I'm going to say when people ask for protection of their speech, say from the platforms, it's always basically a month later at the most, followed by a request that the government make sure that certain people can't say the things that they don't like on the internet. And such it has always been in the First Amendment world, is that the speech that ought to be protected is the speech that I like, and the speech that ought not to be protected is the stuff I don't much care for. So, you know, it's inevitable that this kind of will all reach ahead eventually, like Jeffrey and Whit both. I have extreme doubts that the court will ever actually conclusively decide this. It's going to be a circuit by circuit, you know, melee. But, you know, that's where we are. And I hope to not have to write about this in the near future, but I am not putting any money on that wager.
I don't tweet, to everyone's great relief.
Probably better for your overall mental health. And
the organization that I'm on the chair of the board of directors of, the Free Speech Coalition, as I said, is the Industry's Trade Association. It is an extraordinarily important organization, unique in that it represents the interests of both labor and management. We won a Supreme Court case, the most significant pure First Amendment case in decades, in Ashcroft versus Free Speech Coalition, an attempt to redefine child pornography to take out both the children and the pornography. So that's an organization that I'm very proud of, and plays a vital role in the quality of life and the health of the people that work in the industry. But to address what I think is perhaps the most important point that you raised, and it's that the notion of segregating sexual communication from the rest of communication is it will fail, but it is a dangerous thing to do. Sex is, as the Supreme Court has said in very articulate ways, is at the heart of much of human endeavor, of art, and in our own psychological development. So if you close your eyes to sexual communication, you close your eyes to what is the expression of some essential driving force in the human life. And as one of the sages of the pornography industry said, Annie Sprinkle, the solution to bad pornography is better pornography, not less pornography. So if we didn't marginalize it and didn't come up with silly ass rules, we would have better quality. And it is an enormous pleasure to me that there is mainstreaming of sexually explicit material so that male nudity can appear, because that increases the likelihood that the artistry is going to increase. And at this stage, to say, sex is dirty, therefore we need to exclude it from discussions, from content in an organization, in a museum, is both foolish and dangerous, and does everyone a disservice.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Again, we really appreciate this. It was a good conversation. It was productive. It was fun. I hope this is a topic that people will tune into and stick around for, because as you all have said, this is an important conversation. Although it's it makes your face turn red and might make you embarrassed to think about, it's an important conversation that has a lot of good avenues and things to discuss. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Nice meeting you, Will, Whit, and Ari and Max. Take care.
My pleasure.